I was about 9, I had polio, and one of the conditions of polio was, of course, people were very frightened for their children, so you tended, if you had it, to be isolated. So there was about a year and a half when I stayed at home. I was paralyzed for a while, and so I basically watched television and listened to the radio and played with a tape recorder and puppets, and kind of my day was made up of those kinds of things. I was interested in two things always. One was science and the stories of the scientists and scientific experimentation. I liked very much to work in a shop down in the basement and try to invent things and build gadgets. And at the same time, I was interested in stories, and I had an older brother who was very interested in literature, and so I had an early exposure to literature and what have you. But ultimately, in theater, my father sometimes would work in musical comedies, or I would have the opportunity to see musical comedies. And ultimately, those different technical and sort of story interests around high school or early high school, I started to do the lighting, work on the lighting of the drama productions and be around the shows. And so I started to become interested in theater, and I thought I wanted to be a playwright because I was interested in stories and telling stories. One afternoon, I remember around 4 o'clock in a building called the Little Theater, I noticed a notice that they were going to show a film called 10 Days That Shook the World by Eisenstein. And I went in to see it. It was pretty long, and there were only 2 or 3 other people. But I was so impressed with this film, and it was a silent film, but so impressed with what cinema could do, and of course having quite a bit of experience in theater. But at that afternoon, I think, was when I decided that I would not go into theater. And this, of course, was one of the elements of the Eisenstein film that was so exciting, was that how the editing was able to take, that's always fascinating, take this and put it together and have something come out that was neither of those two things. And of course the sense of rhythm that editing can do. Even I was struck, I remember on 10 Days That Shook the World, how although it was a silent film, there were sequences where you actually almost could hear the machine guns firing because of the way it was edited. So it's a form of alchemy, of magic that is very appealing. I think cinema, movies, and magic have always been closely associated, because the very earliest people who made film were magicians, and one of the aspects of it was the idea of an illusion, a magical illusion in the early days of movies. A lot of early magicians began experimenting with using basically what is cinema to do their illusions, and of course we know that some of the early pioneers like Méliès and what have you were magicians and used cinema to create illusion. So it was a little bit, I think cinema always had, as did theater for me, this ability to create some kind of magic, either through lighting, but to use technology to create magic is what appealed to me, I think. I had a number of teachers who hated me, at least I felt. I was not, I didn't do well in school. I did very well in school my first year and a half, and we left that school. I really quite liked that first school I went to, and life for me at age 5 and 6 was pretty wonderful and perfect. But then I went to a number of other schools. I went to many schools and went through that whole New York school system, PS this and PS that, and I found them very frightening and like penitentiaries, and I didn't do well in those schools, maybe partly because I was always moving from school to school, but nonetheless I do remember teachers who really singled me out for their discouragement. And in fact, I had a very sort of heartbreaking experience, because as I said, when I was 9, I always wanted to be a guard, because I was a new kid in the school. Guard was, in those schools, wore a yellow button that said guard, and they would be a hall guard or a stair guard or whatever they were. And the girl that I thought was the most wonderful girl in the world was a guard, I remember. And when I when I got polio, of course, I was taken out of school, and then about a year and a half later, I went back to school, and as they had a little ceremony and, you know, kind of welcomed me back, and they gave me, they made me a guard as part of, I guess, my being taken back into school. And my teacher, Mrs. Hemachandra, who you know, really was, I think she was a very bright woman, but I remember her as an oppressor. But I remember like a week later, she said, well, why should you be a guard just because you were sick? And she took away my guard button, you know. So I landed a job with Roger Corman to do originally the job was to take a Russian science fiction picture that he had bought, and he wanted me to write the English dialogue for. Of course, I didn't speak any Russian, and then I realized he didn't care whether I could understand what they were really saying, and I just wanted me to make up dialogue. And he wanted, the movie really was a very idealistic science fiction picture, you know, and he wanted to add some monsters and kind of have the story be related to that. So I got that job, and I worked very hard on that, and then ultimately I became Roger's assistant, and that meant I had to wash his car, and you know, he'd have me work as a dialogue director in the morning on a Vincent Price movie, and of course they would pay my salary, but then I would leave at, you know, 1 and then go work on his stuff, so he would basically get me for for free. So the great thing about Roger was he exploited all of the young people who worked for him to the fullest, but at the same time, the other side of it was he really gave you responsibility and opportunity, so it was kind of a fair deal. Roger said he was going to make a film in Europe and asked me if I knew anyone who could be like the sound man on it. So I said, oh, I could, you know, and of course I didn't know anything about, I mean, I was good with technology, but I had never done the sound, so I took the recorder home and read the instructions, and Roger did take me. So I showed him, you know, the 3 pages I wrote that night, and which was, of course, the most garish kind of action scene I could come up with, and he said, okay. And I went off, he gave me a check for $20,000. Yeah, he sent me with a young woman who had worked on the production who was going to be the co-signer. And I went to Ireland, and when I was in Ireland, I met another producer, and I said I was making a film for Roger, and this guy offered to buy the English rights for another $20,000. So I had now $40,000. But Roger, of course, expected to get his $20,000 back, still make the movie for the 20, which the English rights, and get the film for free. But I sort of just duped him. I just took both checks and I put it in the bank, and I had this young woman sign a check, and I just kind of made the amount for the whole amount, so she basically was out of the check signing. So then I made the movie for $40,000, which was this little black and white horror film called Dementia 13, which we made in about 9 days. Godfather was a very appreciated movie when we were making it. They were very unhappy with it. They didn't like the casting. They didn't like the way I was shooting it. I was always really on the verge of getting fired, so it was an extremely nightmarish experience. You know, I had 2 little kids, and a third one was born during that, and we lived in a little apartment, and I was basically frightened that that they didn't like it, and I was, you know, they as much as said it that you know. So when it was all over, I wasn't at all confident that it was going to be successful. I'd never ever get another job. I went off, and I don't know why I was in Paris, but I was in Paris, like staying all up night writing this Gatsby script, and that's when The Godfather opened. It was this enormous success, you know. So I would just get a phone call and say, "Oh yeah, it's going great. Everyone loves it." I said, "Oh yeah, really? Oh, I can't get this script done," you know. And it's ironic that probably the greatest moment of my career, certainly that, you know, I was around 32 or so making The Godfather, having such a enormous success, wasn't even one that I even was aware of, because I was somewhere else, and I was, you know, again, under the deadline. So I don't have, certainly it was a wonderful night when we won all those Oscars for Godfather 2, because that wasn't, at first that picture came out and people really didn't like it too much. But I have to be honest that I associate my motion picture career more with being unhappy and being scared or being in trouble or being under the gun, and not at all with anything pleasant. I wrote the script of Patton, and the script was very controversial when I wrote it, because they thought it was so stylized. I mean, it was supposed to be like a sort of, you know, The Longest Day, and my script of Patton, was sort of interested in reincarnation, and I had this very bizarre opening where he stands up in front of an American flag, gives a speech, and ultimately I wasn't fired, but I was fired, meaning that when the script was done, I said, okay, thank you very much, and they went and hired another writer, and that script was forgotten. And I remember very vividly this long kind of being raked over the coals for this opening scene. My point is that what I've learned is that the stuff that I got in trouble for, the casting for The Godfather or the flag scene in Patton, was the stuff that was remembered and was considered really the good work. In your own time, usually the stuff that's your best idea or work is going to be attacked the most ferociously, probably because it's new or because they had never seen an opening of a movie like that, or seen a gangster movie done in the style. So you have to really be courageous about your instincts and your ideas, because otherwise you'll just, knuckle under and change it, and then things that might have been memorable will be lost. The grips will tell you that you don't know what you're doing, or the camera operator or the cameraman, everybody. I mean, when you go on a set, that's one of the reasons George Lucas never directed again. No one knows this, but when he made Star Wars over there in England, George is sort of a little skinny version of me, and he's doesn't have the most physical kind of stamina, and he was so ridiculed and sort of, that kind of jock-like attitude that Cruise can have, putting him down for what he was doing and stuff. He was so unhappy making Star Wars that he just vowed he'd never do it again. And plus he was like diabetic, so he was a little sick, and that you really have to. That's why someone today said you ought to love what you're doing, because especially in a movie, you really have to love the project and love the story, because you will. Over the time, you really will start to hate it, and the fact that you say, gee, but I really like what this is about, is a very valuable asset. Most Italians who came to this country are very patriotic, and what that meant was just that there was this exciting possibility that if you worked real hard and you were loved something, that you could become successful and wouldn't be held down, due to who your family was and what have you. And certainly in my case, I found that to be true. I became, quite successful very young, and it was mainly because I would have to say it's because I was so enthusiastic and I just worked so hard at it. Our generation represented a major transition. It was the first time, certainly, that film students were given the chance to make films. Film in the past was it was a profession that you kind of worked your way up. Frank Capra was a prop man. I think John Ford was a prop man, and it was a little bit of a father and son thing, and you kind of worked your way up. And when we all went to film school, my class and my comrades there, we didn't think we were ever going to really get to make feature films. We thought we would end up making industrial films, or possibly, some be on the fringe, or maybe get involved in television. My aspirations when I went, I had no idea. I just wanted to be part of the film business. I had no idea that I'd really get to direct feature films or to be successful at it. And, of course, my story is that when I was going for my graduate degree, I decided I was going to make a feature film as my thesis. That's what I was famous for, was that I was not only the first film student to kind of become a professional director, but I also had my thesis film be a feature film, which was You're a Big Boy Now. So a lot of younger would-be film directors started to come and hang out, because I had an office at Warner Brothers. I had directed Finian's Rainbow when I was 23 or something. And pretty soon all these kids, some of them my age, some of them a little younger, started hanging around out with me, and I had a little money, and I had a lot of ambition to set up a group, a company. And so that's when I met George Lucas, of course, who was younger, and then he had all of his friends, and ultimately it became kind of this gang of young filmmakers who really were friends and hung around together. The key thing about film students at that point is we all wanted to work in 35 millimeter, and film students were junkies for equipment, And so suddenly I had penetrated the Hollywood studio, and due to a very funny circumstances, which is that the company I was with, which was Seven Arts, had bought Warner Brothers. So for a while, no one knew who was running it. So I sort of just had the keys of the whole studio, and it was as though we suddenly had Warner Brothers, and we walked around and talked about, oh, we're going to get animation going again. And before I know it, there were all these guys coming there, and we'd talk about it. And that's when I met people like Carol Ballard and George Lucas and John Milius and Phil Kaufman, I remember, and Brian De Palma, and later Marty Scorsese. They were all like a few years younger, and they, then we really decided we were going to be independent. We were all going to move to San Francisco, and we did. And that company, produced some of those people's first films, George's films and what have you. And ultimately, but I had always wanted to be part of that type of artistic scene like you hear about in Paris. What might it have been like to be there, and there's Hemingway in the Ritz Bar, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, or Sartre, and these wonderful people. And when we were there broke, trying to figure out how to pay for anything, little did I realize that in effect that's what that was, that all those people were to go on and become wonderful artists and stuff. But then it just seemed like we were just a bunch of young people who were, wanted to take over the movie business. And in a way we did, but in a way we didn't, because we really wanted better things for it.